Okay, so great to have you all here. Let me just share my screen. Just, yeah, this is the one. Can everyone see the title screen?
Yeah.
And can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Okay, that's great. I'm just going to stop video because we'll be focusing on the slides, and then I'll turn it back on whenever we have any questions or back at the end. So if you have any questions or comments, I mean, please let's try to make this very interactive. Please shoot your questions and comments, and we can talk about them. Not just to me, right? We can have other people try and share their thoughts as well. Um, First, just to get a sense of of the participants that we have here, do we have a mix of both PGP1 and PGP2s here?
Yeah, so predominantly it's PGP1, but yeah, I can see a couple of PGP2 here as well. So,
Great, great. So guys, okay, welcome to the. I think it's been about 3-4 months since your PGP1 sessions have started. You must have gone through the initial hazing phase and then the hazing by the professor. So yes, all that happens. I hope you're busy making your CVs and prepping for your right. The Sunday evening, and suddenly the classes popped up, and you decided to attend. Thoughts on what do you expect from this session? What do you want to get from this session? Please drop in your comments on the chat window. Thank you. So Aval initially said to understand digital products beyond mobile apps. That actually caught me off guard. And then he says trying digital. So the statement is to understand products beyond mobile apps and such. Yes, we will take a look at a very good case study where to a non-tech product, actually there is a lot of technology involved, but the final product is a non-tech product, which showcases great product management. Milan says ideating the features and solutions to suggest in the design interview. Great. And yes, we will try to do a workshop on that. Saravana says, how do you ensure inclusivity in digital products we design? That is actually like a master's itself, right? At places which are very medium and stuff, you have entire teams, and by inclusivity, I'm assuming things like accessibility features. There are two things so there are two other aspects called localization and globalization, both of which are required to publish any app. So just as an anecdote to give you some context, a lot of study or research, you'll find that there are certain accessibility thumb rules. For example, if you want to highlight something on screen, it shouldn't blink too fast, because that can actually cause an epileptic seizure among very sensitive epileptic patients, right? So how do you design for inclusivity in those cases? Or for example, you should not communicate any kind of information only through color. So say you have a green line and a blue line, and the green line indicates something, the blue line indicates something, there is no accompanying text or whatever. You cannot have that kind of a situation because people may be colorblind, or more simply they might be using black and white monitors, which is very uncommon today. But it's quite possible that they are colorblind and they cannot see which one is green and which one is blue. Both of them appear gray for them, right? So they won't be able to make out what you're referring to either in the text or in your product help or things like that, right? So these are certain inclusivity factors that that you'll kind of stumble across while you're talking about and looking at designing products. However, that is not the focus of today's session. We will be looking at an overview of product management, how your product management career grows, and so on. I'll come to that slide in a minute. But thanks for that thought, Sarana. We can have a one-on-one conversation to talk about it in more detail. Moving on. Okay. Yash says how to tackle design problems from scratch. Great. Okay, my voice is breaking slightly. Let me see if I can move to a different place. Okay, sure. Is this better? I moved to a place with stronger internet, so hopefully that's better.
Yeah.
Pranay says how to develop design thinking, and yes, that's again a great topic or a great thought. So I don't know whether you have any previous work experience, Pranay, especially in software and in the Agile and Scrum method. So actually, Agile and Scrum are design thinking applied to software. Design thinking can be applied to any problem in the world. But when you apply that to software with some tweaks and whatnot, a broad framework, that is where you get Scrum and Agile. And to be very honest, Agile and Scrum are extremely poorly implemented in most companies in India. They are much better in the West, usually American companies, but they are implemented very poorly because in India we tend to go through the motions, which say that hey, Scrum means you need to have a Scrum meeting, but they don't understand the philosophy of why you need the Scrum meeting and the fact that it's supposed to be a quick catch up and so. But great thought, Pranay, how to develop design thinking. Again, not exactly the focus of today's session, but we can have a discussion to talk about it further. Milan says how to look at and analyze features in popular mobile apps and use them for ideas in the design interview. Great, let's take a look at that. Ayush says steps in designing a product, how to prioritize changes as the product develops. Okay, this was actually kind of the focus of my previous talk on the Ola case study. We will kind of touch upon it, but it's covered in a lot more detail in the previous one. So as Milan mentioned, please go take a look at the recording that's shared on YouTube, and hopefully that will give you some ideas. And Aval says on Agile, how not to get short-sighted while going Agile. It's not an easy easy thing to solve. If it were, India would be doing much, or Indian software would be doing much better on Agile. For some reason, it seems that senior management in India thinks Agile means do more while costing less. And that's not what it's meant to be, or that's not how it works. So yes, thanks for that thought, Aval. How not to get short-sighted? Once I don't know how senior you are, or how much work experience you have and things, but eventually when you do get to lead a team, if you manage to imbibe the core parts of Agile and implement it properly in your team, it will have great. And I can actually do yet another talk, or we can do a one-on-one discussion on how I managed to grow a team of 4 members and teach them product management, and they've become stars. So the CEO recognized 2 of them. They're saying, okay, this girl was a terrible product manager in January, and by April she's a star, right? So yes, applied properly when you have the Agile and the. Tarun says, when we generally look to solve product management problems, most of them involve UX UI design. So how can we improve that skill? Is this important, or these requirements are taken care of by the design team? If you're lucky enough to have a design team, then they should be done by the design team because they're experts, right? It's like someone who's graduated, say class 10 or class 12. To be honest, okay, so yeah, these are just some other thoughts. So so someone who's just graduated from high school is a supreme generalist, right? They're not particularly good at anything, but they just know a little bit about everything. To a large extent, the product management role is like that. You are not a great guy to write code, or to design campaigns, or to make screens, or do anything for that matter. But but a product manager is like a Swiss Army knife, that they are there pretty good or fairly good at most things, right? So if you have the help of a UX UI design team, definitely take their help because they're experts at this. But yes, you should probably imbibe some of the basic principles of UX UI. You'll get a workable design even though it may not be very pretty. And if you can get a workable design, you can probably convince your senior management that yes, this is all I can do by myself. I mean, I don't have the expertise in this. So after this, we need to get an expert. So thanks for the thought, Tarun. Okay, let's get started. Let's move on. Abhishek says lean versus agile. I don't fully get that question, but yeah, drop in a comment later and we'll take a look at it. Let's move on with the session. So today we'll talk about why should someone be a product manager? What does a product manager do, or what does the day in the life of a product manager look like? How do you grow through your career from a entry level or a junior level product manager through different levels of seniority? And what are the skill requirements at each level? The skills required change, right? Okay. How do you start off as a product manager if you're already not one? Since you're in B school, it's actually much easier. But even if you're not, there are some principles or some techniques that you can apply to start off as a product manager, get better at it. We'll take a look at a couple of case studies of how products have been developed, and one example of how product management has been effectively applied in the non-digital world, the non-tech world. What PM interviews are like, and these are typically what you will face in your B school, but I'll also give you some examples of what you would face after your first job. That is, when you want to switch a job, you switch your job a couple of years later and try to become product manager, what kind of questions you might expect to face in an interview. We'll try to do a quick workshop depending on the time and the number of people. I see there are about 50 participants, which can make it quite difficult to handle, but let's see what we can do there, right? Or we can kind of make this an offline exercise and have a kind of group discussion or group submission later, right? Okay, so let's start with why do you want to be a product manager, right? And when you talk to product managers or when you look at job descriptions, this was a common line, a kind of buzzword that was uh, thrown around by HR professionals, by people who kind of became product managers without understanding what they were getting into and wanted to show off a bit to others. So they say, I'll be the CEO of my product, or you'll get to be the CEO of your product, and you'll get to make all hiring decisions. I mean, you'll be able to drive the strategy and roadmap and so on and so forth. And when you hear it like that, you think that okay, you could think about how the different parts of all the different functions that you're learning about at B school, strategy, operations, finance, marketing, supply chain, HR, how do they all come together in your startup or in your business or for your product or your product feature? And you might be imagining that you're doing something like this, but what you're likely going to be doing is something like this, right? You're going to be managing a steaming pile of poop, and you're going to be flying around blind along with other people who are also flying around blind, uh, trying to manage that and get that into some working shape. The other line that you probably hear is that from a specialized role, say a data analyst or business analyst or whatever at their previous organization, and they want to move away from doing the same grind for years and years, and move into a more generalist role where they will be able to wear many hats, get to do many more things. Product management can be an interesting role or an interesting option, and this is what attracts them towards being a product manager. However, this is also not really true because experts do all the work. So if you have if you're building a software product, you're going to have engineers who are going to be writing the code. You're going to have a marketing team that will be doing the marketing campaigns and strategy. You're going to have a finance team. So there are, just like I said, like a general manager doesn't really do any of the functions themselves. A product manager doesn't actually do any of these things by themselves. They might have to get their hands dirty. For example, in a smaller organization, you might not have the luxury of having data analysts. In that case, you might have to do the data analytics part yourself, right? but you're not a really expert at any of these fields. And when push comes to shove, then experts do all the work for each of the different functions, right? The next is that PMs are respected in any company, often due to the title, right? The title sounds pompous and it has the word manager in it. So often you assume that, further up the hierarchy and people might be reporting to you and so on and so forth. Not necessarily. And as you grow in your career as a product management manager, especially if you've been in a certain company for a couple of years, be ready to face this question not just from yourself, but also very blunt others in your organization. They'll ask you, hey, what exactly do you do? What is your role? Why are you here? How is your being here being any useful? If experts are going to do all the work, right, what are you doing in this place? And you better have a good answer to this when that question comes up, either for yourself or from others, because otherwise you'll have a crisis of faith, crisis of confidence in yourself, right? So PM is not critical in a company. At the very start of a company, when I'm talking about when there are less than 5 or 6 people, at that time, in fact, product managers can be an overhead. At that stage of a startup, you probably should not have product managers. You'll have a couple of engineers, maybe a test person, a salesperson, someone who's doing finance and billing and everything else together. And that's about it. You don't need a product manager, right? It's only when you get to the 10 plus head count that you figure out that, yes, you need a product manager. You need someone, you need people specializing in each of the different roles. But once the company is going, once the ball is rolling, the PMs are not really required to keep the ball rolling. There are experts who are going to keep the lights on, who are going to keep the ball rolling, right? So their PMs are not really critical in a company, right? So why are product managers required? They're required for the difference between a mediocre and a successful product. So you have, say I ask you what's an example of a messaging app or short video content app. There are several tens of them out there. You have Skype, WhatsApp, Hive, Signal, Telegram. You have a lot of them, right? Similarly, for say videos, I mean, there's YouTube. There used to be TikTok. I don't even know whether it's still there. And there's Snapchat and Instagram and lots of these apps. And these are the ones that are unicorn plus and highly followed by billions, if not millions, if not billions of people worldwide. There is a long tail of a lot of apps that basically go nowhere, and they try to do just right. Often very mediocre, very run of the mill. They might not even survive past the first couple of years and just run on down, right? So the difference between a mediocre product and a successful product is what a product manager brings to the table. And um, uh, an example that I like to give is maybe say 20 years ago, and I hope most of the people on the talk are at least 20 years old. So probably a lot of households did not have a laptop or did not have a desktop or something at their place, because okay, I mean, computing wasn't very all pervasive. People, not all households had a laptop, right? And if you had asked your parents that, hey, I want a laptop, you would often get a question that, what are you going to do with it? What is it that a laptop is going to do that you're not already doing, right? That is an unfair question to ask. Only when you get a laptop do you realize how useful it is. And it can apply to a lot of useful tools. In fact, when I was asked this question by my uncle and by my parents and things, I asked them, it's the same as having a mixer in your kitchen, right? The mixer is a comparatively new tool. For generations, people used to do their cooking without a mixer or something like that. And I could very well ask you, why do you need a mixer? You can just chop up all your vegetables using knives or using whatever kitchen implements you had earlier. But only once you have it, you start using it for every little thing. It's the same thing with laptops, and it's the same thing with product managers. Once they're there in a company and they show their true worth, it's hard to define why exactly they are required, in the sense that Can those functions not be done without the product manager? Yes. So you can still continue cooking if you don't have a mixer. It's just going to become a lot more difficult. You can continue learning through books and by taking seminars or by doing something else if you don't have a laptop. But it's like a critical component. If you don't have it, your life becomes much harder all of a sudden. Similarly, in any product company, yes, there are individual experts who will do each of the fields, but if the product manager is not there, the or the potential of the startup or the product can go from 100 to a 20. And it's hard to define why that happens. It's just that this thing is extremely useful. It brings together a lot of convenience, a lot of smoothness to the products and so on. Right. So that's a lot of selling about what a product manager is. Right. So given that, why or when should you try to be a product manager? So try becoming a product manager if you enjoy looking for patterns in human behavior. There are often and there are a lot of books written about it, saying fooled by randomness. That's a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and there are a lot of other books, predictably irrational, and so on and so forth, which talk about why humans do rather irrational things repeatedly. They might repeatedly follow a suboptimal. For example, a lot of us don't buy insurance. Why? It's an objectively stupid thing to do. But people, I mean, not the insurance penetration in India is less than 5%, right? It's about 3.5 to 4%, right? Why? People just have that problem. There is a pattern of human behavior which is unpredictable, irrational, right? So if you enjoy looking for patterns in human behavior, if you want to understand the process rather than the outcome. So for example, if you were the kid who, when you had to learn something in physics or wherever, and you got stuck on a problem, you asked your friends or your teachers or something that, hey, how do I solve this? And rather than them telling you, hey, you do this and it'll get solved, and you just go back home and do it and you find that it gets solved. If you are willing to ask the question, hey, I don't just want to know how to solve this one problem, but what was the thinking process that that person adopted, so that they figured out these are the 4 steps to be used to get to this problem. Because once you get to the root of that thinking process, you will apply it not just to that one problem but to other problems as well, right? So how did you reach the conclusion rather than the conclusion itself, right? An important insight. The other thing is, you'll find many operations or many processes in the world are inefficient, and that inefficiency is a symptom, it's not the problem itself. Let's take an example. Say uh, movies, or getting food of your choice, or getting medicines, right? Why am I taking these? All of them should ring the bell. Startups that have come up in this space, or software solutions that have come up in this space in the last couple of years. So for medicines and pharmacy delivery, you have a lot of startups. You have 1mg, NetMeds, and so on, that give you quick and easy medicine delivery. Earlier, that was an inefficient process. You had to go to a doctor, they might give you some brand name. You might not know what the composition of that brand name is. You have to rely on your chemist, who may or may not have an alternative. The pricing was entirely much more expensive than probably an alternate brand with the same composition. All those got so those are all inefficiencies in the process. That was a symptom of an underlying problem that needed, and the pharmacy delivery, pharmacy search kind of solutions solve that problem. Same, which bring you exactly the dish that you want from the restaurant that you want. So they figured out that the problem was logistics and the entire distribution issues. They solved that, and now food is no longer a problem, right? So inefficiencies in the process, first of all, they are not at all obvious. It might seem that, hey, this is the way things have already always been done. Maybe you don't even know that there is an alternative way to look at it. So till 1mg and NetMeds and things came, people didn't realize that, okay, there could be an alternate way to buy medicines, or an alternative way to buy food, till Swiggy and Zomato came. Only once they came and they got hooked onto it, did they realize that, hey, why would I ever go back to my previous process of solving my problem, right? So try being a product manager if any of these thoughts interest you. right? As I said in the previous slide, can you deal with existential crisis? As I said, someone who's trying to be stubborn and saying that, hey, my kitchen mixer is not necessary, my laptop is not necessary, I can still do all my Excel modeling and learning from my books and things. Why do I need a laptop? They can put a laptop manufacturer at the risk of an existential crisis. So if you go to Apple and say, hey, your laptops are useless or your phones are useless because everything that you provided is available through non-digital means, sure it is. Now if Apple doesn't have the self-belief in itself to know that it is actually making a useful product, it will not succeed in being Apple, right? Similarly, if you don't understand why being a product manager is useful or what value do you bring to the table as a product manager, then you might suffer from this existential crisis. Why am I here? What am I doing in this organization, right? So have the self-confidence and the self-belief to know that you are a successful PM and what you bring to the table, and that will start you off on your foray into product management. Can convince people to do what you want, and we'll touch upon this a little later in the slides as well. A large part of being a product manager, a large part of being any manager for that matter, after you get out of B school, you will figure out that it is getting people to work for you, and by not reporting to you, right? As a product manager, often you will not have anyone reporting to you, but other people in the organization need to do what you say, right? So getting them to listen to you, convincing them that this is the right thing to do is a huge part of being a leader and a manager in general. Unfortunately, or whatever, a lot of B schools don't focus on this. You end up focusing on hard skills like what are the frameworks used in marketing, what is the discounted cash flow valuation method to value a bond or a stock or something like that, what is the debt to equity ratio which is optimal. These are all hard formulas and hard techniques which you can always look up online, but rarely do B schools teach you that the skill required to thrive in the workplace is to be able to get other people to work for you, right? You will all of you will go through this crisis. You will learn it by yourself. It's like learning swimming, in that you will go through the pain and eventually come out of it better and more equipped to deal with this crisis. But this is a very, very core part of being a product manager, because you don't have formal authority. You need to be able to exercise leadership through informal authority and convince people to do what you want them to do, right? Now, let's take a look at the different types of product managers, and there are a couple of types here. So the first is a very execution focused PM whose core delivery or core output that they bring to the table is that they can ship products on schedule, on budget, and with the right quality. They're usually extremely organized. Often they come from the PMO function, which is the project management office. Project management is very different from product management, and I recommend you either read the book called Cracking the PM Interview, or just read a couple of Quora answers, or just Google for the difference between project manager, program manager, and product manager. They are very different. At least the product manager part is very different from the other two. Even product manager, project manager, and program manager are different from each other. And let me just give you a quick one-liner here. So a project is one deliverable. For example, running a campaign is one project, and that will have a project manager, right? That is just one campaign. Say Swiggy wants to run a campaign saying 50% off on everything ordered on Diwali. That is one project. It needs to have a project manager who is going to execute that campaign. Not execute the campaign as in they're not going to design the campaign and send it out and stuff. It's more of a governance role where they say, hey, has the campaign been designed? Has the target or audience been identified? Is the infrastructure ready? Is the financing team ready to fund such a campaign? And so I'm just taking the example of a campaign, right? It could be any project. Building one building is a project where a project manager. A program manager oversees a bunch of projects, all of which have an outcome. So for example, building a smart city, or that is one level of program management, which is just building one building, but a whole bunch of infra. Do you have, what kind of civic infra do you need? Do you have the right again, it's called civic infra in the sense of, do you have the right electricity, water supply, sewage and stuff? Do you have the right digital infra? Do you have internet connectivity everywhere in the city? Are the cities well designed with parks and areas and business areas? Are the roads well designed, well designed such that there's no traffic pile up at certain parts of the city? So this would be a program, right? Each of the lines that I mentioned is a project. Will have a project manager. The whole part is a program. Building 100 smart cities, which is the vision of our prime minister, is an even bigger program, right? And that will have a more senior level or a higher level program manager. A product manager is they are both governance mechanisms in the sense that they don't really design anything. They ask, is this on track? Is there someone looking at it, right? Is there a risk of it going haywire? That is what they are looking at and continuously reporting. Whereas a product manager designs a feature or designs how a product or a feature works and how is it supposed to get delivered, and takes that to delivery. So that is very different from how a program manager or a project manager works. Anyway, coming back to the types of product managers, so you have the execution PM, who's highly focused on getting the feature design in order and making sure that you don't slip deadlines due to random unforeseen circumstances. A couple of engineers may have fallen sick, or they just at the nth minute they found out that one very important core scenario was not addressed, and hence the product won't work at all. So all these kind of risks are identified and solved earlier in the cycle, and this is what an execution PM does. The next is the user experience PM, and I found a couple of questions about user experience. So they put all product managers have to put the user's viewpoint first, but this depends on what do they excel at. So the user experience PM tends to focus on building a smooth experience for the user, and they are good at designing interfaces, right? Often they have an understanding, and it could be a formal understanding or it could be an intuitive understanding of aesthetics and psychology. How is information laid out on the screen? What is more important? What is less important? And what needs to be highlighted? Which are the elements that look like they are interactable? Does a button look like a button, or does it look like text? And people don't even understand that this is what I'm supposed to click and so on, right? So the user experience PM often designs, and this is more towards software. They could design the interface with the user. It can also apply to non-software products, like how should a car's steering wheel look, or how should a microwave's buttons look, so that they very easily tell the user what each of the buttons mean and so on. So that is what you mean by a user experience PM. And the third is a business PM, right? So they focus, and each of these have a growth path within themselves. So the business PM often becomes a growth hacker or a growth product manager, because they focus on driving partnerships, opportunities, and the business side of things. What are my financial operational metrics? How do I track them? How do I dig into metrics more to figure out what went wrong? What is the point in a multi-step process where people are getting dropped off, and what can I do to address it, and so on, right? So these are the different kinds of product managers. I do see that there are some comments. I will take them in a couple of slides. I'm moving on with the presentation for now. So we took a look at why should you be a product manager and what are the different kinds of product managers. Now, what does a product manager do? What does a day in the life of a product manager look like, right? So these are the tasks or outcomes that you need to achieve as a product manager. So this is what you do in that. This is the value that you bring to an organization. The task that a product manager needs to do is to be able to identify problems. So first of all, figure out that there is a problem, right? And often a lot of you would have heard anecdotes that, or you would have seen in your cases that organizations even refuse to accept that there is a problem. So first figure out that there is a problem, and then identify what that problem is, right? Once you've identified the problem, design a solution to address that problem, right? And I made it very clear that design a solution to address that problem, because often when you're faced with a vague problem, people end up designing solutions that don't address that problem. I don't know what they address. Often they address something irrelevant, or maybe that is not that particular problem that is getting solved. It's solving some other problem. So ensure that once you identify the problem very clearly, uh, you are able to design a solution that tackles that particular problem, right? While designing this solution, you need to make trade-offs. It will be, cost versus time to market versus efficiencies versus skill set, and a lot of things versus maybe your engineering architecture, or things that say, hey, if you want to change something now, it's going to take such an overhaul of entire engineering that it's going to take a year. Can't we reduce the experience, or can't we reduce the performance by 20% and get to market next week rather than waiting for a year, right? So those are the kind of trade-offs that you will need to make. Crunch numbers. So after you make the trade-off, design a solution, and get it implemented, crunch the numbers to be comfortable with looking at numbers. What are the usage patterns like? Where are the errors happening? What are 80% of the customers doing? You will find that if you build a product with multiple features, 80% is the normal Pareto rule. 80% of the users use 20% of the features. So can you enhance those 20%, and can you get rid of the long tail, the remaining 80% of features, which simplify your product a lot? Can you figure out what any early warning signs of what could go wrong if you start scaling up a product too much? So those are the kind of number crunching that you need to do. Manage people. Yes, as I was talking about earlier, by manage people, I don't mean they report to you that you're their manager. By manage people, I mean you influence what they do. You dictate what they do without authority, right? So you need to manage people's egos. You need to manage people's needs to understand. So your engineer, to whom you are giving a requirement, needs to know why you are building this, and he will ask you, hey, why should I build this feature? What is the use of, will it drive any numbers, right? So you need to be able to convince the engineer that yes, this is why the feature is important. You can't tell him build it because I said so. I'm the product manager, I get to design it, you just get to build it. Not at all. That guy is not reporting to you. They might just say, sorry, I don't think this is justified, and start escalating matters. So you should be able to manage people in that, manage their expectations and their so that you can convince them and get them to play on your side rather than against you, right? Communicate. So you do all this, but it's not enough if you're working in a silo and you're doing great work. Senior management needs to be able to understand what you're doing. And again, in this case, they're usually the architects or the engineers who are taking the requirements that you're giving them and building something. And you need to ensure that they have not misunderstood, because they will go off into a hole and build something, and after 2 weeks you don't want to be faced with a situation that, hey, this is not what I asked for, because they built what they understood from you, right? So be sure to communicate upwards, sideways, downwards, every direction you want, very clearly, at the risk of over communication if required, right? And what do you get? Because when you wear so many hats and when you do so many tasks, maybe you get paid more. Even that's very iffy, because it depends on a lot of companies. For example, Google is highly product manager led, and whatever product managers say usually drives the agenda. They define the strategy. They define even the architecture on how things are to be implemented and so on. There are a lot of other companies, for example, Oracle, to some extent Microsoft, are largely engineer heavy, and you might often find that engineer at the same levels, an engineer gets paid more than a product manager. That's just the way companies and roles are structured from company to company, right? Now, to accomplish these tasks, you have a set of tools. So these are like the outcomes you need to achieve, and just like you would have tools in your workshop or in your kitchen or so on, you need a bunch of tools to be able to achieve these outcomes of these tasks, right? Now, what are the tools that you would have? Market research. Market research is used to identify problems, right? So you would do some market research and competitor analysis to figure out what are competitors doing, how are they doing whatever they're doing right now, right? Interaction design is used to design solutions and to some extent make trade-offs. So interaction design is a subset of, is essentially the same as UX design. where you so market research, you have identified a problem using market research, and now you need to design a solution to address it. So not just the math or the algorithm behind how that solution should work, but also how does it manifest to the customer? How does it look and feel like to the customer is solved by interaction design. While making interaction designs, you will have to make trade-offs of, text examples. You would be making trade-offs at even a higher level, saying, hey, I need to trade off cost versus that, right? So you would be making those trade-offs. Interaction design is part of a product manager's toolkit. Data analytics, again, used to crunch, make trade-offs, and used to people and communicate, because you can convince people with your analytics, right? So it can be rudimentary analytics. Can you just read a trend graph or something over time and figure out that, hey, this is where something spiked, this is where something had a negative spike, and was this by design? Did I run a campaign and did that cause a spike, or was this a bug that my feature didn't work or something, and hence my usage of my feature dropped on that day, or at least I'm not able to measure the usage on that day. There was an outage in my measurement systems. Was there an externality? For example, the IPL is running, and of course you can't attend it right now, but say it was a normal year and it was being held in different cities in India. Maybe you will see a sudden surge in people ordering home on a gate, or a lot of cabs being booked on a Tuesday evening, though people generally don't go to clubs or pubs on a Tuesday evening, just because they want to go watch the game or they want to go towards the stadium. So are you able to read analytics and put context around it? Computer engineering, again, as I said, a lot of this is focused on tech solutions, and what has stuck with me is that early question from one of the participants saying, are there non-digital solutions where product management is applied? Of course there are, and we will take a look at them. Most of the presentation, however, is geared towards digital and more likely mobile apps or websites kind of product management that I'm speaking about, right? So in that sense, you don't need to be a you know a coding expert or a computer engineer know how compilers are designed and so on and so forth. You just need to know that there are things like APIs and databases, and APIs basically read from databases and send it to read from a front end and send it back to a database. Rudimentary computer engineering, so that you know enough to talk to the engineers, or you know enough to talk to, because you're in B school, you will automatically pick up the jargon of the remaining disciplines. So you will know what finance says when they say, hey, should we capitalize the salary cost? You know what it means to capitalize something. Or marketing says that, hey, there is no brand identity, or it is not clear. Or they say our color scheme doesn't gel with our persona. So this is all jargon that you pick up while you're in B school. And I know a lot of you are PGP ones. You'll probably go through all these courses in the next couple of years and be able to understand what I'm saying. Computer engineering will, because it's a technical field, and not everyone's a computer engineer, though they can be a product manager. Also, post B school, you even if you're a computer engineer, you'll probably lose any context or any what should I say, background of whatever computer engineering you've done earlier in your career, but try to be familiar with the rudimentary elements of computer engineering, right? So those are some of the tools and tools required to accomplish the tasks done by a product manager, right? There are some artifacts of, now before we go to the documents, let's take a look at some of the common questions. Class monitor. Class monitor is a project manager, right? He is even more than a project manager. So they often have people who are entirely into corporate governance. Their job is to hold and ding whoever misbehaved a class monitor. Though you have a class representative that is more like a mouthpiece, that hey, can I give this guy a task and he will farm it out to the rest of the class. So for example, if there's a homework assignment or if there is something that needs to be photocopied and distributed, you just have a point of contact, but that person's job is not to enforce discipline, right? So in that sense, a product manager's job is not to enforce discipline in the rest of the company. We assume everyone's an adult and behave responsibly. Tarun says dropping off due to class. Okay, Tarun, there is a lot more in the session, but if you're dropping off, great. I hope you will be able to watch the recording later. Sudarshan asks, what all technologies should we have knowledge on for being a PM? So the PM role is not so much technology specific. It can be, but it is not so much technology specific as it is industry specific. And the point is to become industry agnostic, right? What you will need to imbibe are a bunch of skills. So are you good at identifying problems? So all the things that we spoke about in the previous slide, are you good at identifying problems? Are you good at designing an MVP solution and then iterating through it, right? Now, I was good at that, hence I was able to do it at Ola, which is in the cab hailing space. I'm doing the same at Bajaj, which is in the healthcare space. I did the same in banking and finance, right? So that is a core skill rather than a technology. It doesn't matter whether you know R or Excel or Python or something else. That is not what defines you as a product manager, because those technologies and tools will change. You can even have hard technology skills, like you can be a great data analyst, but that might make you a data analyst and not a product manager. You would rather want a data analyst or a business analyst supporting your analysis than become a data analyst yourself. So does that answer your question, Sudarshan? Okay. Okay, thanks. So let's move on. What are the kind of documents that a product manager owns and needs to create throughout the life cycle of rolling out a product or a feature? Right. So the first is a product roadmap, and this is often more of a senior management kind of artifact. So once you become like a product director or something like that, you'll be owning a product roadmap. This essentially defines the next 6 to 12 month features that you want to build. Just the headline items, like I want to build a feature to uh, say in the case of healthcare where I'm working now, to allow teleconsultation. I want to build a feature to allow people to get lab samples from home pickup, right? Just that one liner saying that this needs to be done. Then, so as I said, it's a more senior management kind of role. At an execution at an entry level PM level, you'll pick one of the items from the roadmap and flesh it out very thoroughly in a spec document, which we're going to come to next, and hand it over to engineering, right? The product roadmap, in a sense, is used to prioritize. So it says that, hey, these are the more important ones, the low cost, high impact ones, which I'm going to do earlier, and the more fuzzy ones, or the ones that probably can be high cost and we don't know about the impact, they can be done later. So it's effectively a document that reflects prioritization. From the product roadmap, you pick up each of the product line items and write a feature spec for them in a little more detail. So this actually describes the design and the inner working, the look and feel, what are the constraints, what are the access criteria, and that you would need to have, which is one of the items of the roadmap, work correctly. Just a moment. Okay. The next is sprint planning. Now, this overlaps with the execution PM or the agile, kind of role, where you often the product manager for a product plays the role of a scrum master, though they're not supposed to. That's what I meant by India doesn't do scrum very well. But so let's talk about reality. So sprint planning essentially tells you that, hey, you've got several feature specs, or you've got a huge spec for a feature that probably will need to be rolled out in multiple phases over a long time. So you break it up into little chunks, which are called user stories, and schedule them for release one at a time in different sprints, right? So sprint planning for your feature, or if you're effectively running the sprint for a team, several product managers might be handing their feature specs to you, or they may be handing requirements to you. Sprint planning is essentially how you schedule delivery of one or more features across a period of time, right? Rollout plan. Now, this is something that is often overlooked. To be very honest, I have actually built a rollout plan and stuck to it to some level of detail only at my work in Ola, and here at Bajaj. I'm realizing how useful that was and trying to convince senior management that we should be able to do this. What do I mean by rollout plan? How do you go to market, right? And this flows directly from my previous talk about the Ola feature, where I say a phased rollout. You start off with a very small user base and then scale up in steps, rather than have a view that as soon as the sprint is completed and the feature is built, just throw it out to the whole wide world, right? Doing that is a recipe for failure, and you will come across far too many problems. So in a sense, the rollout plan that is a checklist that says, in the first week of October, I'm going to roll out this feature to 5,000 customers only, maybe in Bangalore. By the end of October, I'm going to roll this out to 50,000 customers across the metro cities, right? And by the end of December, I'm going to roll it out to all my customers across all of India, right? So it's just a plan that says how are you going to scale up step by step, and it's an anti-explosive device, right? After you roll out, you need to track the numbers or the metrics that indicate success or failure. So that is what is done in tracking dashboard. You have several tools. You have Google Analytics, Localytics, CleverTab, so on and so forth. You have a lot of tools that can measure metrics throughout your product funnel and display them on a dashboard. That is used for monitoring whether uh, there are two kinds of metrics, which are essentially funnel metrics and impact metrics. And I think there's a slide about it later, which is essentially, is your feature working as designed? That means maybe the feature doesn't achieve its outcome, right? But does it go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 properly? So is it working as designed? So those are what are called funnel metrics. And once you get to the end of the funnel is when you would want to measure whether it has the impact that you initially thought of. You thought, I'm going to build this feature to increase my revenue or to increase my engagement or my adoption or something like that. Is it actually doing that? So those are the impact metrics, right? So it's not enough for you to track all of this on your own. You need to report, and again, this kind of overlaps with the project management role, where there are regular monthly reports, weekly reports, or something where you need to tell senior management. Senior management is not going to allow you a budget or time saying, hey, you are the owner of this feature, do whatever you like for the next 6 months. I'm never going to ask you. Obviously, you're going to have to give them reports every now and then. So it has to be made uh, understandable for them, right? You might have very, very micro metrics that talk about, was this button clicked and did the response come within 300 milliseconds and so on and so forth, which may be relevant to you, but they are not what a CEO is looking for, right? So can you figure out from a reporting perspective, what are the important funnel metrics and impact metrics that you want to report and create a reporting format for the wide world or for senior management to consume, right? So that is part of the stakeholder management piece. Okay, um, I will get to the questions after this slide and the next slide, right? There seem to be a bunch of queries. Guys, if I'm going too slow, too fast or something, please do let me know. We can change pace accordingly. Okay, so what is jargon? Every industry has some industry specific terms that mean certain things within uh, that industry. For example, even the word normal means different things for for something in geometry and psychology, right? So the words tangent and normal mean something very different in depending on the context. So you have different, every industry has its specific technical jargon. So in the stock market, you will hear terms like ROE, return on equity, price to earnings, support levels, valuation and stuff, which a layperson will not understand. Similarly, in manufacturing, you have lot size, inventory, utilization, and so on, which again a layperson won't understand. In retail, you have what is merchandise, what is a stock keeping unit or SKU, what are the store layouts, what is the store inventory cost, a bunch of specific terms or technologies that they use. And I'm going to dump it down to the level of a 5-year-old. And this is how I recommend you think about it. It's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but not exactly so, because this is, we all like to wear masks. And I mean, I'm not talking about the mask that you're wearing during COVID, a mask of feigning importance, though deep down you may know that, hey, what I'm doing is probably not really very important. So when you tear off that mask, or when you look under it, you realize that, okay, what this person is trying to say is usually something that can be said in very simple language that a 5-year-old can understand. So this is the kind of jargon that product managers use, which can be translated into something that a 5-year-old can understand. So what they say and what they actually mean, what a product PM says and what they actually mean, works like this. When they say target customer, so it's taken from marketing, right? Who cares? Who cares about your feature, right? So you might hear the term being phrased as, okay, who is your target customer, or your target demographic for this feature? It may sound very rude. You say, who cares, man? Who's going to use this? Kisko farak padta hai, right? So that jisko farak padta hai, the person who cares is your target customer. Core value of a proposition. Everyone is selling something. At the end of the day, it doesn't have to be selling like a telemarketer or whatever. Your product is selling something to someone, right? Otherwise, then nobody's going to use it, or nobody's going to pay for it, right? So what is the core value of proposition means? What are we peddling? What are we selling, right? One is who is going to buy it and why should they buy it, right? Ambiguity. You have no clue what's happening, and these are all terms, corporate jargon terms that you will hear in the meetings in the boardroom, in these stinker meetings that you're going to have with senior management, where they say, hey, why didn't this happen? This thing was supposed to be delivered 1 week ago. It has so many bugs and it is still not in shape and stuff. So once you get yelled at, you'll say, sir, there was a lot of ambiguity in the requirements, or there was a lot of ambiguity during the execution. You're basically telling your boss that I have no idea what's happening, right? Justification. Why should we do this, right? Why should we do this and not something else? So your engineer may be polite and ask you, what is the justification for this feature? He basically asks you, why should I do this, man? I might as well go take a nap or watch Netflix. Why are you making me do faltu work, right? Dashboard. You can easily replace a dashboard with a bunch of numbers, but people like colors, people like graphs. I'm of course dumbing it down. Graphs and visuals are useful to quickly and effectively communicate things, but you can do the same with numbers. So dashboards basically means I like colors. Aligning dependencies means, so yeah, this is often the project management and definitely a lot of product management, which is again, your CEO or your chief product officer gives you a task saying, hey, Arun, can you get this done? And I panic and I say, oh, yes, sir. I'll align all the dependencies and push it through. It invariably comes down to chasing a bunch of people and pestering them, saying, hey, please, ye karwa do na. Can you please get it happen? Otherwise, hold it again in my next meeting. So that's how you align dependencies, right? Roadmap is simply what we do next. That is the chart that you have for the next 6 to 12 months. And a tech task is often what non-techies say when they come across a term in technology and they don't understand it, and they say, no, but this is a tech task. Why are you telling me about this? They're basically saying, I don't get it. I'm too stupid to understand this, right? So your engineer might say, hey, I need to change the API endpoint on my API gateway, right? And the other guy who's probably not a computer science engineer doesn't understand anything. He's like, this sounds like a tech task. Why are you telling me about it? The guy doesn't get it. It's too stupid to understand this. Okay. Any more questions and comments? Oh, I don't see any. Good. Now, how do you grow in your career as a product manager, right? So how does it change as you go through levels of seniority. So your title often starts with associate PM, and that's an entry level product manager, and the competence required at that time. So once you this is the competence that you need to develop. How do you know that you've developed it? Once you get the ideal outcome, and once you get the ideal outcome a couple of times, you can probably go tell your boss saying, "Hey, I'm ready to get promoted to the next level." So the core competence of an associate PM is to write a spec. That means a specification document, and the ideal outcome that they want to get to is where their specs are signed off in one review meeting. They talk to the engineers, they talk to the designer, whatever, and rather than coming back with 20 questions saying, "Hey, you have not addressed this scenario. What will happen if the user clicks this? What will happen if the user has purchased X by and whatnot?" You will have all these different scenarios basically. This and come back again for a second review. If you can get to the point where all of those have been thought through and the specs are signed off in one meeting, then you've been able to own the spec document fully and are probably past the associate PM level. The next is the PM or the product management level, which is delivery management. So the first is basically documenting requirements or being able to clearly communicate requirements. This after requirements are communicated and understood, there are still a lot of gaps that happen during delivery, right? So, and you hear of software projects that are 70 to 75% of software projects fail their miss their deadlines and their cost budgets. Think of things like the metro projects or even other most other projects for that matter. I have been on projects where I was brought in a year after the scheduled date because it was still not delivered. I came in and did some stuff. I'm not saying that I'm great or I was able to push everything through, but I pushed whatever I can. Other people obviously did a huge amount of work, and then you'll find that in 3-4 months after that, something does get delivered, right? So a good competent PM should be able to ship features as planned on budget, schedule, and quality, and master the art of delivery management. As you grow through more senior levels and you get a title of a senior PM, it's not just getting things out of the delivery pipeline, which is the engineering and the test pipeline, able to see what was getting delivered. Are you able to iterate on it? Are you able to identify these were the problems, these are the issues that were happening at each step of the delivery, figuring out what are the bugs or the improvements or enhancements required and getting them identified and implemented, right? And again, if you want to see a good example of this, I refer you back to the previous video on the case study, where there were a lot of iterations of the feature before it finally took shape. So yes, a lot of bugs and features identified. At a lead PM level, so you basically start owning the roadmap, right? So you have proposals. You say that I propose that we do these features. You can even do it by theme, and I don't want to go into how road mapping exercises are done. Rather than have a bunch of features and you will never be able to prioritize or schedule those features because the world changes too much. So I can't, for example, say that in October I want to deliver these 3 features, in November I want to deliver these 2 features. It's never going to pan out that way. By the end of October, my November plan will be thrown out the door, right? It's better to speak of themes, saying that in October I'm going to monetize all the products that we have. In November, I'm going to acquire more customers, and through November and December. In January and February, I'm going to improve engagement, right? So these are the outcomes that I want. There will be a bunch of features. I'm not going to go into what are the features used to drive each of these outcomes. So those are the kind of things that you will own as a lead PM. I mean, it's something that's dawning upon me now. While I'm playing this role, and it's not as though you need that. Once you get to a more senior position, you've mastered the previous position, or it's not it's not a hard and fast rule. So, for example, just because I'm a lead PM now doesn't mean I can write any spec flawlessly, right? Not just because I've forgotten. It's just that it's not that you need to master this before being able to get to the next level. You need to become really competent at it. You need to get good. You need to become good at it. But it's not as though you can't even do the rest without figuring out one. And to an extent, every product manager, even an associate PM, contributes towards the proposal presentation and the roadmap presentation and so on, towards iteration of features. But it's just a broad uh, lay of the land as far as seniority of PMs is concerned. When you get to the director, PM, and further levels, the job role now becomes that of any senior manager level, right? Where you need to upskill and mentor your team. Now you are a good individual product manager. You're able to write a spec. You're able to get it delivered. You're able to iterate on the feature, suggest features to senior management of to the team, and they are able to, but they get convinced by your ideas. How do you teach these skills to a team of 4 or 5 people, right? And how do you know when you've been able to teach them? You're like I had mentioned about one of my team members earlier, who was not able to do something at one point of time, and 3 or 4 months later she was able to do it. So team members can do things that they earlier couldn't. That is when you know you are able to upskill and mentor your team better, right? So that is when you have become a good director level PM. And after lead PM, or from lead and director, they are all kind of interchangeable. The titles may vary quite a bit, right? And the last is just that you've mastered everything that is to know about product management, plus a little secret sauce, so that people can't figure out exactly why you're so awesome, but people soon because of your awesomeness. Okay, moving on. And PMs like pyramids. So representing the same previous slide in a pyramid form, you start with spec writing, then managing the team and delivery, ownership and iteration of your feature to be able to identify gaps and iterate on solutions. Then managing senior management. Managing your boss is a very important technique that you should probably learn as soon as you get into your workplace. We can talk about that later, not in this session, maybe one-on-one later. So how do you manage senior management to come on your side and not just keep yelling at you? Grow your team, grow them not in numbers, but in terms of skill and abilities. And finally, you become God, right? And improve consulting style. A lot of, just like one of the comments said, how do you move to a strategy role? And as I'd spoken about earlier, I think I spoke about to a different person maybe earlier today, that a lot of product managers want to move to what they call the strategy role. So become part of the chief strategy officer's team or something like that. This is often this is a role well played by consultants, right? And consultants really like to label everything on the pyramid. So they'll start, and it could be entirely useless. So they just label stuff like lower bottom of the pyramid, upper bottom of the pyramid, middle of the pyramid, lower bottom of the pyramid, top of the pyramid. I'm not kidding. As I said, I've been a McKinsey consultant. I have labeled stuff for absolutely no good reason. And then I thought, what help does this labeling achieve for anyone? But yes, moving on. Okay, so we spoke about how does a product manager grow. Let's look at how to start off as a product manager, right? You start off as, say, an associate PM level or PM level, and need to master how to write a specification document, a spec doc. That is the bread and butter of a product manager. And there are a bunch of steps that are required before the spec doc is finally created, right? Each of these steps need not be very long. They could even be just a few hours each, but they need to be done for a good spec doc to come about, right? And what are these steps? Industry research. So so for example, let's just take some example which I am not familiar with, and I'm expecting a lot of people on the call may not be familiar with. Say something like iron and steel industry, right? What are the regulations? What are the common challenges or opportunities in the industry? What is the general growth rate like? What are the average profit margins like? What are the asks of the industry as a whole? So is Indian steel not tensile enough? Is it not good quality? Is it too expensive because of distribution challenges? What is the general industry's layout, right? So that you would want to research. Competitive analysis is basically the analysis of individual players within that industry. What is the relative pros and cons, or what are the differences between the offerings within that industry? So if you talk about steel, what is the difference between Tata Steel and SAIL and Jindal Steel and any other steel, right? Is one of them meant for retail use, maybe in houses and buildings and things? One of them may be used in, say, flyovers and bridges and stuff, and maybe primarily serving government and larger contracts. Something may be used for some other form of steel, I don't even know. Whatever, maybe automobiles or something like that. So they might have, even within the industry, there will be different products with different strengths. Each player will have a certain competitive advantage and disadvantage. So you do that competitive analysis to figure out. So these are some 6 attributes that are there among all the players in that industry. So where is the gap, right? So that gap is what becomes your problem statement. So you say, hey, there again, I'm sticking to the example of steel, and I will be way off the mark. I have barely any understanding of this industry. So you might say that, hey, I find there is nobody who's offering, say, steel for, I don't know, what would be a good example? Steel for, say, utensils, right? There's no one who specializes in that, right? Uh, so that could be an opportunity, saying that there is a demand for it. People need steel for utensils. I'm not going into volume and stuff like that. Maybe people have done that research and figured out it's not worth it. Whatever, I'm just taking it as an example. So you identified that, hey, among the 5 different competitors who are in this industry, there seems to be this gap. Nobody's addressing this gap. So this is the problem statement that I've identified. I'm going to design a solution to address this gap or to address this problem. So there's a solution design phase. And then finally, you do the expected impact analysis. So you did a solution design that will address the problem. So what? Will it increase your revenue? Will it increase profitability? Will it increase usage? Will it decrease costs? What is the expected impact of the solution that you designed, right? Which is going to solve the problem that you identified. So these are all the different parts of what you would write in a spec doc, right? So what is the general structure of a spec? What are the different sections of a spec? So the first is the why, the justification. Why are you building this feature at all, right? And this is a business justification. So you will explain the first 3 parts, saying, from this industry, I did this industry research, I did this competitive analysis, and I identified this problem. This is why we need a solution. This is why we are building this solution. So problem statement identification is kind of the answer to why. Who is the target customer persona? So again, when you go through your B-School courses, probably in your branding course, in your marketing course or things, you will figure out about customer segmentation and customer personas and things. So who is the target customer persona? In the case of a retail product, it can be very, very specific. Is it a 25 to 35-year-old urban male working in a white-collar job and earning above 15 lakhs per annum? Or is it a tier 3 town elderly female who is maybe retired or probably does not have much of an income for herself, and they have these hobbies, and these are the activities that they tend to do? So can you define your target customer persona exactly? This could be a reference to another doc, by the way. So often in large companies like Microsoft, they have 6 or 7 personas identified and well documented in a separate persona doc. So you can say, so let me just give you an example. Just by the name, you'll be able to figure out, right? Say you have someone, you have a persona of a girl called, say, Neha, right? I'm just going to say the name. You have Neha, and you have, say, someone called Lakshmi, right? What do these tell you, or what kind of images do they bring in your head? All I give you was 2 names, nothing else, right? So target personas. So Neha, I mean, in my head, Neha is probably younger, working professional, maybe drives a car and whatnot. Lakshmi, again, could be possibly this, but in my head, it brings up the image of a slightly older lady who may be working fair enough, but maybe retired, has a family, probably a couple of kids and whatnot, right? So just by the name, you have associations, And target customer personas are generally described very, very well. They say that Neha is a young working professional living in a tier 1 city. She has a software job. She is unable to find time to cook for herself. She drives a scooter to work and whatnot, right? She uses online tools for booking tickets and for ordering groceries and food and things. So this is how you define the target customer persona. She's unable to save anything because she's still paying off her education loan or whatever, right? Whereas Lakshmi will have a different set of attributes. Anyway, moving on. What are the goals and non-goals, right? So this is kind of the expected impact. So by building this feature, what do you expect to achieve? How is this feature going to work, and how is it designed? How is it expected to work? How is it expected to be built? And this is, this is the bulk of the spec document. So often this takes about 80% of the spec document, but the others are very important. I have had in my team features getting rejected or features not going into the sprint because the engineers couldn't understand the first 3 questions. It's not enough to start jumping into the solution and say, hey guys, I need to build this page where there's going to be this button, and then when you click that, the user sees this. People are going to ask you, why are you building this? What is this expected to achieve? Until you make this clear to me, I'm not even going to start on this. And as a product manager, you have no control over that because they don't report to you, right? So the first few sections are very important, though they may not be very long, right? What to measure? Metrics, we spoke about it. Funnel metrics and impact metrics. Is the feature developed as designed? So whatever was written in the how part, was the final deliverable developed as per the design? Those set of metrics are the funnel metrics. Does the feature as a whole do what it was intended to do? That means, does it achieve its goals and non-goals? Are the impact metrics, right? Then you have considerations like constraints, regulation, language and platform. For example, is it supposed to work both on the web and on a phone? Is it supposed to work on a very, very low end phone or only on high end phones? Does it require a camera or something like that? Is it supposed to be available across multiple languages? Are there any regulations? So in industries like finance and healthcare and whatnot, there are going to be a ton of regulations. Are you compliant with all of them, right? Or even medicine delivery, right? Do you have a prescription? Does this person have an Aadhaar card? Are they of the legal age limit? Can you deliver schedule something drugs? For example, if someone asks for, say, I don't know, some kind of restricted drug, are you able to deliver it do you allow people to order it online and deliver it? Could be a lot of regulations that you would need to consider while building this kind of a feature of a product. So a tip, have a version history for all of this. Whenever you strike something out or whatever, move it to a separate section called annexure or previous history or whatever. And on your first page, have a version history that says, on this date, I changed this from here, from this thing to this thing. So it would be a one-liner saying that I changed my design from a 3-page thing to a 1-page design, right? So that when you come back a year later and a spec is a living document, right? It will continuously get updated as your understanding of the customer, or your understanding of the lay of the land, as your understanding of the constraints in building it keep evolving, will keep modifying the spec. So when you look back several months later, or someone asks, hey, why was it built this way? Why was it not designed differently? You should be able to look back to your version history and say, hey, on that day we decided in this meeting, or on that day we decided, hey, we want to do a revamp of our entire UX. So we threw out our old thing and we made this new one. Now that constraint doesn't hold, maybe we should go ahead with your suggestion. Otherwise, if you don't have a version history, people won't know why you made some of the decisions that you made. Moving on, let's take a look at some of the case studies or examples of how a spec is written or how good product management was delivered in the real world, right? The first is the WhatsApp reply feature. And this was probably relevant when I made this deck, probably, I don't know how long it's been several years, right? So everyone must have used this feature where you can swipe earlier. That's a great insight actually. So now you can swipe right on a WhatsApp chat, and that brings you into reply mode. So now you're going to reply to that text, right? Just a couple of years earlier, you had to select that chat that you wanted to reply to, and there was a reply button at the top bar, right? It required 2 clicks and not just one gesture of a swipe. So someone found that people were using reply a lot and iterated on the feature to make the gesture simpler, right? Now, what do you think would be the justification for such a feature? Why would such a feature be developed? You may or may not remember WhatsApp before this feature was developed, but what do you think could be the justification for this feature? So Arun asks, please tell a little more about spec writing, how elaborate it should be on features, what all meetings with developers and designers should be conducted before writing it. Now, this is a, ouch, okay. How do I define non-goals? So one thing is, Arun, you can probably you can talk to me one-on-one. So there's a lot more about spec writing, and we can do a mentorship session or a coaching session on things like that. What are non-goals? I'll just give you an example of non-goals with respect to this reply feature. The next case study, I think you should all stick around for. And yeah, so the first is justification. Why? So before the reply feature, people often, if there's a group chat or there are long threads and you reply to something that was said several tens of messages ago, people would lose context of what exactly you're replying to. And you had to say, earlier you had mentioned this and this is my reply to that comment. Now you can just swipe that comment and people know exactly which one you're talking about. In fact, I think after the swipe gesture, or maybe before, they also added this feature, which is basically you tap the quoted text and it takes you to the quoted text, right? So you can see what was around it. Who is the target customer? The target customer is high frequency WhatsApp users familiar with common gestures. So say, for example, you have, say, elderly people or someone who's not familiar with smartphones and they don't know what it is to swipe or to long press or something like that, then they will not be able to use reply, right? So it has to be a high frequency WhatsApp user. If they're not using it very frequently, then they probably don't need reply, right? What are goals and non-goals? The goal is to provide context to long conversations, not to increase usage. So Milan, in your question, what is a non-goal? The person who designed the reply feature did not say that reply is going to bring me 20% more customers. No, it is for existing customers. Or people are not going to start using WhatsApp more frequently because there is a reply. It's not going to increase usage, right? The goal was to probably increase engagement or reduce friction. In this case, the friction is context in long conversations, right? So the design will have the full description of UX, in this case, swipe and tap, and how does it look like. So you can probably see 2 lines of text, and after that it's just ... out, and it could be in multiple languages and so on, right? So all those things are written in the design, right? What happens if there is a link in the original text? What happens if there's a link that is attached in the reply? What happens if there's an image and you reply with an image? And all these kinds of things are all described in the design. Metrics talk about things like number of users, number of times used, how many conversations were they used in, what was the average distance or median distance between the comment and the reply. And the constraint is that it's cross-platform. If I use this feature on an Android phone, it has to appear on WhatsApp web and on an iOS phone, and vice versa across many. Earlier there used to be Windows Phone as well. So across all of these platforms. Yes. Given the privacy concern, how were the metrics captured? So they're just numbers, right? Number of users who used it, not who are the users who used it. And number of times that it's used, not, again, none of the PII, personally identifiable information, is captured. Guys, I understand you have a class quite soon, so I will jog through the rest. And okay, you could have told me a little earlier, we would have sped it up. Anyway, I highly urge you to take a look at the next case study, and that's about the end for today's session. We don't need to do the workshop. So this is a case study of great PM thinking in the Delhi Metro. How many of you are from Delhi and think that the Delhi Metro is the best metro ever in the country? And how many others have a friend who's from Delhi and has told you that the Delhi Metro is the best metro ever and are sick of hearing that? Right? So, okay. So who recognizes this gentleman? Any answers? Metro Man, yes. So this is Dr. Sridharan. I think he's a Padma Bhushan or Padma Vibhushan. Let me just check. Yep, he's a Padma Vibhushan Dr. E. Sridharan, also known as the Metro Man of India. And so this was probably during the Vajpayee government that he was given this problem statement, and it obviously took a lot of meetings and so on. So Dr. Sridharan was given the problem statement, and this is the example of a non-tech product, right? This is a non-digital product in the real world. I'm telling you how the problem statement and how good product management was done. So the initial problem statement was, a very fuzzy problem statement saying, hey, we want to build a metro so that we'll give affordable transport to poor people, and that will ease traffic congestion. Delhi is too crowded, roads are too crowded, so we want to build this thing. Now, Dr. Sridharan and his team obviously took a closer look at all this, and they figured out what is it that actually causes traffic congestion. It's not the poor people, right? It's these huge personal cars. They are not buses. Poor people travel in buses. It's the huge personal cars, the SUVs that have one or two people sitting in them that are taking the maximum amount of space and causing a traffic congestion, not buses, right? So the rich are the guys who are causing the traffic congestion, not the poor. So this is what a traffic jam looks like. How many buses do you see here? Right? You see one in the back, there's not even a bus, there's some kind of office coach, and everything else is a car, right? And this is what caused the traffic jam, not a bunch of buses. And you want to get from this situation to this situation where you have a metro running and the roads are relatively free. Look at it, there's even an auto going in the wrong direction and whatnot. Anyway, but if the roads are relatively free, there are a couple of buses, and all the cars that were occupying space on the roads have now disappeared. All those guys are now sitting in the metro. Why does this matter? Because the revised problem statement is that you are building a public transportation system for the rich, not for the poor, right? This has huge implications on revenue, costing, quality, even where you're going to place the metro and so on. It has to go through the rich neighborhoods, right? You can charge a premium. You can probably charge 50 rupees a ticket. It's still less expensive than for a rich person the cost of taking their car out, but it's too much for a poor person, right? It also has to be extremely clean, extremely safe. You can have signage in English because you can probably expect that the rich understand English. So the quality standards that you need to maintain should be enough that the rich people say, hey, I would rather take the metro than take my car. It should not be dirty and dingy like, say, many other suburban railways. I think Mumbai Suburban Railway is an exception. It's actually pretty good, but several other cities, they're in a pathetic condition, right? If it's like that, even if it is cheap, even if it is mass transport, efficient and stuff like that, the rich people who are causing the traffic jam problem will not get rid of their cars. They'll continue using cars, right? So once you revise the problem statement in terms of who is the customer and what is the problem that you're trying to solve for them, is when you come up with an amazing design like the people did for the Delhi Metro. And that's why it's a great success, right? 20 years after, I think it was developed, it was finished around 2005 or something like that. 15 years after it was developed, we are still talking about it. It is probably the longest metro network in India, getting continuously upgraded, automation, a lot of improvements and enhancements. It's an amazing work of art, right? So who is the customer? It is the rich who drive a car to work. And what is the problem? Viable public transport alternatives so that they don't need to take their cars to work, right? So this is a thinking of how defining the problem statement very precisely, defining the customer persona and the value proposition for that customer persona can change the solution entirely, drastically, right? Okay, what do you say? Do we take a quick look at the PM interviews, or do you want to drop off and let's do this later?
I think this should be good. I mean, you can discuss this PM interviews because a lot of PGP ones are really interested in how to prepare for the PM interview. So this should be very helpful.
Done. Okay. So what are PM interviews like, right? Generally, product management interviews are about 3 to 4 rounds, and some weirdo companies have insanely high or insanely low number of rounds. Like they might take you after just one interview, or they might take 7 interviews in the case of Amazon. So Amazon has 14 leadership principles, and each interviewer is allowed to test the interview on 2 leadership principles. So they have 7 rounds of interviews. If any interviewer is not fully convinced on one of them, they might have a follow-up 8th or 9th round. Right? So they have a weird number of interviews. A lot of people ask me, probably not applicable to this forum, is that do you require an MBA? You actually don't. you need to have this perspective that we discussed in the previous Metroman example, that can you figure out what the problem is, who the customer persona is, that is the person, and can you figure out what difference it makes to the business rather than the MBA degree itself, right? A lot of people ask about previous experience, what have you done earlier as a product manager and so on. The way to attack such a question is not to describe what is the solution that you built, but rather what is the problem that you solved, right? There's a big difference here. The thing is, as employees, we get caught up in a solution. You spend 90%, 95% of your time just building the solution, running around people, getting things executed and delivered and so on, and you get caught up in it. But can you take a step back and convince the interviewer that, look, this was a problem worth solving, and this is the problem that I was trying to solve. There were 3 options or 3 or 4 solutions that I came up with. One of them I rejected due to cost. One of them I rejected because it would take too long and it would cause a delay in go-to-market. So I went with the third one. How you build the third one, people understand. You're from IIM Lucknow. You are, easily among the best and the brightest. You'll be able to crack this. That's not a problem, right? The next question you might get asked is, what is your prioritization or stakeholder management style? Do you tend to keep it very formal, which could also be good, right? It's not that being formal is bad. Formal is good in several companies, and several companies encourage it. Walmart and Oracle and things encourage very formal structures. Or is it very informal? What happens when there are problems? Do you tell the whole world about it early so that they are informed, or do you try to tackle it for as long as you can, and then only once you've tried 6 different solutions do you give up and then tell the rest of the world that, hey, I've tried it but I'm not able to figure it out, please help me? That could cause pain in the stakeholders, because they might say, hey, why didn't you tell me earlier? I would have helped you earlier, right? On the other hand, if you escalate too early, people might say, okay, all this guy does is try to escalate, right? So what is the stakeholder management style? What are the challenges that you faced when you were working in your previous company, or when you're working in your previous organization? Obviously, there were challenges. It's impossible that you had no challenges while at work. If you say so, then the interviewer knows that you're lying, because there's no job in the world that doesn't have challenges. So can you identify the challenges and tell the interviewer, this is what you faced and how did you go about, or what did you do to tackle those challenges, right? The other one of the interview rounds definitely is a product design round, which is when you'll be given, it's a core of a PM interview process, and you'll be given sometimes maybe a hypothetical case, and for smaller startups and things, you'll be asked to solve their current problem. And we'll just in a moment take a look at what these kind of product design solutions or product design questions are like, right? Product design questions are often structured like this: design an X product or X service, sorry, for a wide demographic. Sometimes most of the times the demographic is provided, but not always. To do Z is very rarely specified. So to do Z is actually the problem itself, right? So that they often expect you to tease out. If they give it to you, that's great, but often not. And in those cases, state your assumptions, explain your assumptions, if anything is not specified, and move ahead. Right? It's a lot like a consulting interview in a certain case, in a certain way. Or they might ask you about existing products. So they might ask you, what is your favorite product? What do you like or dislike about it? And what changes would you like to make to it? Usually it's a tech product, as in it's an app. They might say, of all the phones in your app, which one do you like best? And if you were the product manager for that app, what would you change about it? Try to avoid talking about the very, very cliche apps like WhatsApp and Uber and Facebook and stuff, because so there are a couple of reasons. One is the interviewer has probably heard this 20 times from other interviewees, and there's nothing new that you'll be able to tell him. There's no new idea that you'll be able to say, I'm going to change this. They've heard everything that comes. Secondly, each of these companies or these products has a ton of product managers working on them, and they have no cost problems, right? They're all very, very well funded, very rich companies. So if they're not developing a feature, there's usually a good reason for it. It's either not at all viable, or it can't be built, or there's some privacy concern, something's wrong. That's why the existing product managers in those companies are not building that feature. It's not a taboo, but it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to pick this kind of a product like WhatsApp or Uber and be able to suggest something that convinces the interviewer, right? They're usually able to poke a hole when you pick something like this. Try picking a different product or a different app instead, right? Remember from the previous example about the metro, most important questions to answer are who is the customer and what is the problem that you're trying to solve for that customer, right? We'll take a look at what do you mean by this in a second. Cherry on the cake is if you can, at the end of this entire design exercise, you can talk about what are the metrics that you would measure to know if your solution succeeded or failed. They might not obviously ask you this, but at the end, just before you wrap up, if you say, hey, I think we've come to the end of our design. Now, these are some of the metrics I would track to know whether we succeeded or failed. No, that's great. This probably means you've cracked the interview, right? So there's a quote from an unknown person, often attributed to Albert Einstein, that says, if I had 1 hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solution. Often it's rephrased by saying that if I had 1 hour to chop down a tree, I would spend 50 minutes sharpening my axe and only 10 minutes chopping down the tree, right? So all of it comes down to how much clarity can you get on the problem statement in this case. Who is the customer and what is the problem you're trying to solve for that customer? Spend an inordinate amount of time on that. The design of the solution itself will be very, very simple after you get clarity on these questions. So what are some of the example design problems? Things like design a reservation system in a hospital. So you have a hospital where there is a reception counter, there are doctors, there are patients, everyone is stressed out because the patients are asked to wait too long. Doctors are either overutilized or underutilized. The receptionist is constantly under stress trying to manage the schedules of all these people together. So how would you design a hospital reservation system? Or design Google Now or any kind of personal assistant like Cortana or Alexa or something like that. If you had to build features for it from scratch, or if Alexa didn't exist and you were asked by Jeff Bezos that, hey, if you want to build a personal assistant, what would you do? Would it really end up looking like the small box that sits on your table, or would you pick a different form factor for it? What would you have it do? What would you not have it do? And so on. How would you design this, right? Design a parking lot management system. So suppose that's all. Let's say design a parking lot management system. You would want to figure out who is it? Is it in a mall? Is it a public parking lot in the middle of a city? Is it inside a residential housing complex? What is this? What do you mean by a parking lot? So who is the customer and what kind of volumes do you expect? Whom are you building it for? Right? What is the problem that you're trying to solve with this kind of a solution? The more clarity you get on it, the better you'll be able to design it. Imagine that you just assume it's a mall and you start diving into it, and at the end the interviewer says, hey, I was expecting a parking lot or or guest parking for a apartment complex. Then everything you said is basically irrelevant, right? So design the IRCTC website or any website for that matter, design the Economic Times website. What would that look like? Design an alarm clock for the blind. So if someone was a blind person and you had to design an alarm clock for them, how would they set the alarm? How would they reset the alarm? What all would they use it for? Would they use it for knowing how long the cooker has been set to cook? Would they use it for knowing how long something has been set to bake? Would they use it? Of course, they'll use it for waking up. Would they use it for knowing when the TV programs come on? You never know, right? Design a toy vending machine for kids, or maybe more generally, a vending machine. It could be a money vending machine, a food or a snacks vending machine, some sort of thing for kids. Again, what is a kid? Is it someone who's very young, a preschooler kind of thing, or is it a teenager? Why does that matter? Because the level of English that you can use can differ. A teenager will understand nearly adult level English. You can use English to communicate instructions. A preschooler won't understand that kind of English, so you need to use a lot more catchy interface. Has to be very simple, has to be error proof, because young kids might make an error. You can probably trust a teenager not to make stupid errors, or maybe you can trust them to be stupid, you never know. Anyway, so these are some of the kinds of problems that you will get in your design interview, right? And let's break off here. I'm going to give you the workshop problem statement. You can try to work on it yourself and reach out to me later for any queries or if you want to discuss. The workshop problem statement is to design the cupboard of the future. So think about where the cupboard will be placed. Is it placed in a bedroom or a kitchen or the washroom or a garage or the living room? Why is it futuristic, right? So you're designing the cupboard of the future. What is it that makes it of the future, right? Um, who would buy it? And this is what I mean by who is the customer persona? Why would they use it? That is obviously the second question. What is the problem that you're solving? Are you just building it because it's should I buy it just because it's from the future, or is it solving a real need for me? What can go wrong? And by what can go wrong, don't give answers like the cupboard could break. That is true of anything. Your phone could break. That doesn't mean you don't buy a phone, right? Uh, what can go wrong in the design itself? Maybe your future cupboard has to be always connected to the internet, otherwise it doesn't open. So what happens if there's a power outage? I can't open my cupboard, right? So do you have these kind of problems that can happen? And things can go wrong, right? So this was the workshop that you might want to work on by yourself. But with that, we actually we'll just run through how you can transition to being a PM. That's pretty easy. Maybe not relevant for you right now, but during your internships or during your work experience, try to work with a senior PM for a coaching kind of experience where you can share a delivery of a feature with them, volunteer to write a spec, uh, ask an opportunity to present to the engineering team or to the senior management team, and work with the senior PM first to figure out, hey, are my presentation skills good? Am I able to convince my audience? What are the different kind of feature ideas that you could come up with? You don't have to sit and ideate by yourself. Talk to all sorts of people within your company as well as outside. If possible, talk to customers and ask them, hey, how are you using our product now? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Talk to marketing, sales, anyone, customer service especially, because they really are in touch with the customers. They know all the problems of the customers, and figure out if you could build any feature you wanted, what feature would you build? These are general gyan that you might want to build up your PM muscle in everyday life. Are you able to identify common irritations, common friction in things that happen in everyday life? Why is technology so difficult for non-tech people to use? Maybe even they could be highly educated. Even doctors and lawyers who are highly educated find it very difficult to use technology, right? So why does that happen? Take a couple of mock interviews, especially the design problem kind of things, and you'll get better at cracking the PM interview. And so we are done with our session for today. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and you can reach me at my email address or on LinkedIn. And with that, we come to the end. If there are any points to discuss, please do let me know. Jaydev says a data analyst or scientist can become a product manager. If yes, how tough is it? My data analyst in Ola became a product manager after working on our Ola feature, and because I coached her to deliver a couple of features, right? A couple of specs and whatnot. So of course, a data analyst and data scientist can become a product manager. Prashant asks, for existing product, can we talk about a gaming app? Sure, you can talk about any app. You can even talk about WhatsApp and Uber if you really think you have a brilliant feature idea for it. But of course, you can talk about any app, not a problem at all. Okay, so I think we are well past the 1.5 hours allotted. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for being a great participative audience. And I hope this was useful to you. If anyone wants to reach out to me, please do. I mean, I would really appreciate it if you would drop me a line, or if you could give Milan or Yash some feedback. That will help me improve my session and help deliver better content whenever we interact next or with a different batch. That will be great. And if any of you want to connect with me, either for feedback or for just general discussions, do feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or over email. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Arun. I really enjoyed the session, in particular the case studies, and I mean that one about WhatsApp's reply feature. We take these features as for granted, but there's so much thought that goes into these features. So really exciting. It's really nice.
And even non-tech, right? So once you realize, Dr. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. Sridharan. Yeah. So the way he is able to get to break down a problem from the objective to the deliverable that was assigned to him and said, this is not the right deliverable. If you do this, then you will not achieve your objective, and reset expectations accordingly. This is great product management, great strategic thinking in the first place. So yes, thank you, Milan. Thank you for setting up this session. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope you found it useful and enlightening.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.